He had no name, no face, no voice, only a hand through a wall at the coldest hour every night. She never asked who he was. She only counted with him. And now that count begins. The first thing they took from her was her wand, and the second was her name. The wand went at 6:30 in the morning in her own kitchen, while the kettle was still complaining on the hob. 4 Aurors came through the front door without knocking. She knew 3 of them. She had trained one of them, had stood in a cold practice room in the basement of the ministry and taught him how to hold his wrist so a shield charm would not shatter under pressure. And now he was the one who said her name and would not look at her while he said it. Hermione Granger. She had a cup in her hand, blue, chipped at the rim, a thing so ordinary that she would think about it for months afterward, would find it surfacing in her mind at the worst hours, the small, cool weight of it against her fingers. She set it down on the counter very carefully because a part of her had already understood that everything she did from this moment forward would be described later by someone else, in a room, to people who wanted her guilty. "On what charge?" she said. Not a question. She did not have the breath for a question. "You don't have to answer anything now." "On what charge?" The young Auror looked at the wall behind her. His jaw worked. 6 counts, he said. "Murder." The kettle went on shrieking. Nobody moved to take it off. In the end, one of the older men flicked his wand at the hob, and the noise stopped, and the silence that came after it was worse. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses in against the eardrums like water at depth. They let her put on shoes. They did not let her put on a coat. Outside, the September air had a knife in it, and the street was full of neighbours pretending to collect milk bottles. The ministry took 11 days. She would have said before that she knew how the machinery worked because she had helped to build parts of it. She had drafted procedure. She had sat on the committee that wrote the standards of evidence for magical signature analysis, had argued for 3 hours over a single clause about the reliability of residual traces, had won that argument, and had gone home feeling that she had made the world a little more careful. 11 days was what it took for that same clause to be read aloud in a courtroom with her at the centre of it, and for her to hear how beautifully it worked when it was turned around and aimed the other way. 6 Aurors dead, all of them senior, all of them men and women who had shaped the tribunals after the war, who had decided which of the accused walked out into daylight and which went across the water. They had died in their homes and in their offices, and one of them in a lift between the 6th floor and the atrium, and each of them had died the same way, by a binding hex that closed around the chest and did not let go. A spell with a very particular architecture, a spell that had been designed to hold a man without harming him, and then altered minutely, viciously, so that it would not stop tightening. She had written the original. Her name was on the parchment. Her theory, her arithmancy, her handwriting in the margins where she had refined the incantation to make it gentler, safer, less likely to crack a rib. Every death had been logged under her ministry clearance. Level 4, unrestricted night access. Her authorization key, her seal, the particular signature that her magic left on a lock when she opened it, as unique as a thumbprint and a great deal harder to argue with. The prosecutor was a soft-voiced man named Cassian Selwyn, and he was gentle with her, and that was the part she could not bear. He never raised his voice. He called her Miss Granger with a small inclination of the head, as though he regretted the necessity of the syllables. He had a way of laying evidence down in front of the Wizengamot, like a man setting a table, unhurried, precise, turning each thing so the light caught it. He was handsome in the manner of a well-kept house. Silver at the temples, robes cut close, a gold pin at his collar shaped like a set of scales. "I want to be clear," he said on the 9th day, "that no one in this chamber takes pleasure in these proceedings. Miss Granger's service to our world is a matter of record. That is precisely what makes this so grave. Access is not given to strangers. It is given to the trusted." She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded and watched the faces above her tilt slowly away from her, one by one, like sunflowers following the light out of a room. Harry was not permitted to testify. Conflict of interest, they said. He came anyway on the 4th day and sat in the gallery with his fists on his knees. And on the 6th day he was removed for shouting, and after that she looked for him in that seat every morning and did not find him. And each morning the absence was a fresh, specific cruelty. Ron sent letters. She never got them. She learned that later. On the 11th day she was asked whether she wished to speak. She stood. The chains on the chair did not move because they had not used chains, and she understood the mercy of that and hated it, because it meant they wanted the record to show how civilized this had been. "I did not do this," she said. Her voice came out steady and small in that enormous cold room, and she heard it hit the stone and vanish. "Somebody used my work. Somebody used my clearances. That means somebody has spent a long time studying me. And that means whoever is killing your Aurors is still out there. And every hour you spend congratulating yourselves on my conviction is an hour they are given for free." She lifted her chin. "I am not asking you to like me. I am asking you to be frightened of the right thing." Selwyn wrote something down. The verdict took 40 minutes. The sentence took 4 words. Azkaban. Special category. Indefinite. They took her out through the lower corridor so the reporters would not see her face, and it was there, in the last dim stretch before the apparition gate, that she asked her one question. Not of the guards, of him. Selwyn had come down himself to sign the transfer, and he stood with the quill still in his hand, and she looked at that pleasant, tired, symmetrical face and said, "Why me?" He considered her for a moment. There was nothing in his expression that she could use. "Because you asked for the wrong file," he said. Then he handed the parchment to the guard and went back up the stairs. And it was 6 months before she understood a single word of what he had told her. The North Sea is not the colour of water. She had expected something like the sea at Shell Cottage, grey and moving with weather in it. What was under the boat was black and looked solid, like a floor, and it took the light off the lanterns and gave nothing back. There was ice in the air, although it was only September. Her breath came out in a rag of white and went past her shoulder and was gone. 6 guards. No conversation. The prow cut and the water opened and closed behind them without a sound, and after a while she realized that the silence was not natural, that the wards laid over that stretch of sea drank noise, and that she had begun to hear her own pulse in her ears, the way you do in a room with no air. The fortress came up out of nothing. It did not appear on the horizon and grow larger. It was simply not there. And then it was there and directly above her. A black tower on a black rock, so tall that she had to tip her head back and so narrow that it seemed to lean. And the cold coming off it was a different cold from the sea, a cold that got in behind the sternum and settled. Then the first of them came down the wall. Afterward, she could not remember climbing out of the boat. She remembered the sound, which was not a sound, more like the moment before a sound. She remembered her hands closing on the wet stone of the landing steps, hard enough to tear a nail. And she remembered her mother's face, and the empty living room in Sydney with the sheets over the furniture, and the particular way Selwyn had said the trusted, and Harry's fists on his knees, and then nothing at all until she was inside and on her knees on a floor that smelled of salt and iron and old, old sorrow. They processed her in a room with one lamp. Robes off, robes on, coarse grey, damp at the hem, someone else's shape still worn into the elbows. A number. She was given a number, and the man who gave it to her did not use it, and did not use her name either, because he did not speak to her at all. 5th level. Corridor west. The stairs went up and up in a spiral so tight that her shoulder brushed the outer wall the whole way, and the wall was wet, and where it was wet, it was warm, which was somehow more horrible than if it had been cold. Her cell was 3 long paces by 4, a stone shelf, a blanket that had been washed so many times it had no colour. High in the outer wall, a slit of window the width of 2 fingers, letting in a bar of sea light that lay across the floor and moved as the hours moved and would become, in time, the only clock she had. The door was iron and shut, and there was no handle on the inside. She stood in the middle of the floor for a long time. Then she sat on the shelf with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and she waited to cry, because she assumed that was what would happen next, and it did not happen. She was too cold. That was all. Her body had made a decision to spend nothing. Night came the way it comes in a place with one window. The bar of light on the floor turned grey, then blue, then thinned to a line, then to nothing. Somewhere below her, someone began to scream, and stopped, and began again, and the sound was not directed at anyone. It was just something a body does. Then the corridor got colder. She learned very quickly what the Dementors sounded like, which was nothing, and what they felt like, which was memory. They came along the 5th level at what she would later count as a little past 2 in the morning. She heard the man below stop screaming. She heard the temperature change, which is a thing she had not known you could hear, a fine crackling in the ears as moisture froze on the stone. She got her mother again. Then the courtroom, the 40 minutes, sitting there in the silence with her hands folded. Then the moment in the kitchen with the blue cup over and over, the small cool weight of it, setting it down, setting it down, setting it down. When it passed, she was on the floor, and she did not remember getting there, and her cheek was against stone so cold it burned, and her whole body was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with her. Her throat was raw. She had not made a sound. She lay there and thought with an odd clarity that she was going to die in this room, and that it would not be dramatic, and that no one would be told. And then something moved on the other side of the wall. Not the corridor. The wall, the left-hand wall, the one that separated her cell from whatever lay beside it. A small dragging noise. Cloth over stone, patient, unhurried, working its way down toward the floor. She raised her head. There was a gap where the wall met the flags. 2 fingers of shadow, maybe less, where the masonry had shifted in a century of frost and never been repaired. Through it, slowly, something was being pushed. It came into the faint grey of the window light and stopped, and she stared at it for a long moment before her mind would tell her what she was looking at. A shallow tin cup, dented at the rim, the kind they filled once a day and took away again. It was standing upright, and it was full to the brim with clean water, and not a drop of it had spilled. She did not move. Her heart was going so hard it hurt. "Who is that?" she said. The wall gave her nothing. She dragged herself across the floor on her elbows because her legs were not answering, and she put her hand around the cup, and it was cold, and it was real. Through the gap, she could see almost nothing. A hand's width of the next cell, the same wet flags, the same dark. And then, at the very edge of that narrow slot, something shifted in the blackness and caught the window light. Just a curve of it, a dull, wet gleam, low down at the level of the floor, as though a man were lying on his side with his head turned toward her. It was not skin, and it was not an eye. It was iron. She did not drink it. For a long time she sat with her back against the shelf and the cup held in both hands, turning it slowly, feeling the dent in the rim pass under her thumb like a flaw in a coin. Water in a place like this was not a kindness. Water was a transaction. Somebody had spent something to put it through that gap, and sooner or later she would be told the price. "I'm not going to drink it," she said to the wall. "Not until I know what it is." Nothing answered. The cold in the corridor had lifted a little, the way it does after the patrol has passed, and she could hear the sea now, very far below, a slow, dull thud against rock that came at intervals like something breathing in its sleep. "You could have poisoned it. You could have put anything in it. I don't know you." Her voice was hoarse, and she hated the sound of it, thin and reasonable, a woman arguing procedure at the bottom of the world. "I don't even know that you're a person." That got her something. A sound came through the gap, dry and short, and it took her a moment to recognize it as air pushed out through a nose. Not laughter exactly, the wreckage of laughter. Then a voice, low, so low that she had to lean toward the floor to catch it, and wrong in a way she could not name at first. Muffled, hollowed, as though the man was speaking from inside a well, or with his mouth against cloth. "If I wanted you dead," it said, "I would have let the water come from the trough." She held very still. "What's wrong with the trough?" "Rats drown in it. Nobody takes them out." A pause. "The tin is from my ration. I boiled it against the pipe." "There's no fire in here." "There is a pipe," the voice said, with a flatness that suggested he had explained this before to someone who had also refused to listen. "That runs from the guardroom hearth up through the west wall to the 4th level. It is hot at midnight. It is warm at 2. After that, it is nothing. If you hold a tin against the seam for the length of 1,000 heartbeats, the water is safe." She stared into the dark of the gap. You counted your heartbeats. I have, said the voice, a great deal of time. There it was again, that hollowness, the tin edge under the words. She thought of the thing she had seen catch the light, the dull curve of it, and something went down her spine that was not cold. What's on your face? The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. It was not absence. It was a door being held shut from the other side. Drink the water, he said, or don't. But decide before the hour turns, because I want the cup back before they walk the level at dawn, and if they find it in your cell, they will take my rations for a week, and I have no interest in that. Then why give it to me at all? Because you were on the floor, he said, and you did not scream. He said it as though it were an argument, complete in itself, and would not be drawn further. She heard him move away from the gap, cloth over stone, and then nothing, and the not nothing of a person she could no longer hear, but knew was there. She drank the water. It tasted of tin and faintly of smoke, and it was the first clean thing that had touched her in 11 days, and she had to stop halfway and press the back of her wrist against her mouth because her throat had closed. When she was finished, she pushed the cup back through the gap. Her fingers went past the wall into the dark of the other cell for half a second, into air that was somehow colder still, and something brushed the tips of them. Not a hand. Cloth, coarse and damp. He had taken the cup with the sleeve pulled down over his fingers. She lay awake until the light came. Days in Azkaban were not days. They were a distance you covered. She measured it in the bar of sea light, which came in at a slant through the finger-width window and crawled from the east wall to the middle of the floor and then died. Twice in that crossing, the door slot opened and something was pushed through it. In the morning, a mash of grain and water. At evening, the same, colder. The trough in the corner filled itself from the wall once a day with a gout of brown water that smelled of iron and the sea, and she understood within 2 days what he had meant about the rats. Nobody spoke to her. That was the thing that would have surprised her before. She had imagined interrogation, threat, the theatre of it. What she got was administration. Doors opened and shut on schedules that had nothing to do with her. Men walked the corridor in pairs at fixed hours and never turned their heads. She might have been weather. By the 4th day, she had begun to talk to herself and had caught herself doing it and had stopped and then had started again on purpose, because the alternative was to find out what her mind did when it was left completely alone. She recited. That was the discipline she chose. She went through the 12 uses of dragon's blood, and then the properties of the Gamp exceptions, and then the entire preamble to the Statute of Secrecy. And when she came to the end of what she could reconstruct, she began on the arithmancy of binding hexes, and stopped, because that was the road that led to 6 dead Aurors, and a courtroom, and Selwyn's soft, regretful voice. Because you asked for the wrong file. She turned it over and over. She had asked for a great many files in the months before her arrest. She had been building a review of the tribunal records, a tedious and thankless audit that nobody in the department wanted done, because she had noticed quietly over 2 years that the transcripts did not always match the sentences. Not often. Not enough to shout about. But 3 or 4 times she had found a case where the recorded testimony did not support the outcome, where a man had gone across the water on evidence that read on the page like nothing at all. She had requested the underlying dockets. Most had come. One had not. She could not remember the name on it. She had never seen the name on it. That was the point of the thing. The docket had come back with a seal she had never encountered, a black wax stamp with no device on it at all, and a single line of ministry Latin stating that the case was held under the silent judgment and could not be released without the signature of the Chief Warlock's deputy. The Chief Warlock's deputy was Cassian Selwyn. She had written to him, politely, twice. 19 days after the second letter, the first Auror had died. She was still sitting with that when the cold came down the corridor. It came earlier that night. She had learned the hour, and the hour had changed, and the lurch of that, the loss of the one thing she had thought she could rely on, was almost worse than what followed. The crackling started in her ears. The bar of window light seemed to dim, although there was no light left in it to lose. Her breath went white and hung there and would not disperse. She got herself into the corner, back to the stone, knees up, arms tight, teeth locked. It found her mother first, again. It always went there. Her mother in the kitchen in Sydney with her hair cut differently, looking up with the pleasant, empty warmth of a woman greeting a stranger who had knocked at the wrong door. Then the manor drawing room, the pattern of the carpet, the sound of her own voice going out of her in a shape she did not recognize. Then the courtroom. Then, dragged up from somewhere she had not been keeping it, the thought she had not permitted herself in daylight, which was that Harry had stopped coming, and that maybe he had stopped because on the 6th day someone had shown him something. Her hands had gone into her hair. She was pulling. And then, through the roaring, low and even and absolutely steady, Granger. Just that. Her name, in that hollow, tin-edged voice from the gap in the wall at floor level 3 feet away. Granger, look at the water. I can't. You can. There is a trough in the corner and it is dripping. Count the drops. Out loud. I can't. Count, he said. And there was something in it that was not gentle at all, a whip crack of command that went through her like a nerve. Or they will keep coming back to this cell because they can feel you from the stairs. She counted. Her voice came out in pieces. 1, 2. She lost it at 4 and started again. The drip was slow and irregular, and that was the trick of it. She understood later. It required her to wait for each one, to lean forward into the next moment instead of falling backward into the last. 11, 12. Her jaw ached. 19. The cold began to thin. 26. She could hear the sea again. At 41, she stopped because she was crying, and it was ordinary crying, the kind a body does after fright, and it was so shockingly normal that she put both hands over her face and let it happen. He said nothing at all while it lasted. He did not comfort her. Somehow that was the reason she could do it. When she was finished, she stayed where she was, hollowed out, her head against the wall, and she said to the gap, "How did you know they'd come early?" "They come early when there is a new prisoner on the level. You are still full." A pause. It thins. Not because you get stronger, because there is less. That's a horrible thing to say. Yes, he agreed. She laughed. It came out cracked and startled her, and she pressed her wrist over her mouth to stop it, and then let it go, and lay back on the freezing floor and looked at the ceiling she could not see. "You knew my name," she said. The pause was very slightly too long. "Everyone knows your name." You said it like someone who had said it before. "Everyone," he said, "has said it before." She turned her head toward the gap. There was nothing to see. There was never anything to see. But the dark on the other side had a texture to it tonight, a sense of occupied space, and she found that she was speaking more quietly than she needed to, the way you do when someone is close. "They call you what, then, if everyone knows mine?" "7. That's not a name." "No," he said. "It is a number." "Then what's your name?" And there it was again. The door held shut, and this time she heard something behind it. A small, dragging inhalation, tight, as though he had been struck under the ribs. "Don't ask me that," he said. "Not tonight. Not any night." "Why?" "Because when I try," he said, and the hollow voice went thinner, and she understood suddenly and completely that the muffling was not distance and not cloth, that it was metal, that there was iron between his mouth and the world. "It takes something from me, and I have very little left to give." She lay there in the dark with her heart going. "All right," she said at last. "All right. All right. I won't ask." She swallowed. "But I'm not going to call you a number." Another one of those dry, ruined not laughs. "Then you will have to call me nothing at all." "I'll manage," she said. And after a while, when the corridor had warmed by the single degree that meant the patrol had gone down to the 4th level, she added, into the dark, "Thank you for the water." He did not answer that, but some time before dawn, when she had almost gone under, she heard cloth move against stone, and something small and hard was pushed through the gap and left there for her to find in the morning. A splinter of slate, one edge worn smooth, the other filed to a point on the wall over years of patience. Scratched into the flat of it, in a hand that leaned hard to the left, were 4 words. "They will come Thursday." She turned it over. There was nothing on the back. She was still holding it 3 days later when the door of her cell opened at an hour it had never opened before, and a voice she knew from a courtroom 11 days long said, pleasantly from the corridor, "Good morning, Miss Granger. I do apologize for the hour. Shall we talk?" They took her up, not down, which she had expected, because everything in that place had taught her that worse was a direction, and the direction was down. The stairs went the other way, past the 4th level and the 3rd, up through a stretch of wall where the stone changed from black to a dirty grey, and the air lost its taste of drowned rat and acquired instead a smell she had not encountered in 13 days. Coal smoke and beeswax, and very faintly, underneath, the ghost of somebody's tea. That was the cruelty of it. She understood that as soon as she smelled it. The room had been prepared. It was a small square office with a fire in the grate and a rug on the flags, and 2 chairs on either side of a table with a green cloth, and on the table a pot, 2 cups, a plate of plain biscuits. There was a window with actual glass in it, and through the glass a rectangle of white morning sea, and she had to stop in the doorway and take that in like a blow. All that light, all that horizon, after 2 weeks of a slot 2 fingers wide. "Please," said Cassian Selwyn, rising. "Sit. You're cold." She did not move. "You'll forgive the theatre," he said, and his mouth did something rueful, and he gestured at the fire. "I find that people speak more honestly when their hands are warm. It isn't a trick, or rather, it is. But it's a trick that works in your favor as much as mine. He will offer you warmth first," the slate had said, in that hard left-leaning hand, scratched over 3 nights in installments and passed through the gap in pieces. "Take it. Refusing costs you and buys nothing. He is counting what you refuse." She sat down. She held her hands out to the fire, and the pain of the blood going back into her fingers was extraordinary, and she let it happen without changing her face. "Better," Selwyn said, and sat and poured. "Milk?" "No." "Sensible." He set the cup in front of her and did not push it. "I'm going to tell you the truth about why I've come, Miss Granger, because I think we can save each other a considerable amount of time. There have been 2 more deaths." The cup was very warm. She did not look up from it. Frobisher, at his home in Wiltshire, on the 2nd, and Marchbanks, not Griselda, her nephew Alden, who clerked the 3rd Tribunal. Yesterday morning, in the ministry, on the stairs between 4 and 5. He let that settle. Both by the same hex, both logged under your clearance. Now she looked up. "I've been in a cell on a rock in the North Sea for 13 days. "Yes," said Selwyn. "Then it isn't me." "That," he said, "is precisely the difficulty." And he leaned back and folded his hands and looked at her with an expression of such genuine, weary sympathy that for one horrifying second she felt the pull of it, felt the old, exhausted human wish to be believed by someone with authority, to hand it all over and be helped. "He will sound like an ally," the slate had said. "That is the interrogation, not the questions, the tone. The Wizengamot's position," Selwyn said, "is that a Confederate is operating on your instructions, that the killings continue in order to manufacture doubt about your conviction. It is not an unreasonable reading. It is, in fact, the reading I would give if I were being paid to give a reading." He turned his cup a quarter turn on its saucer. "My own position is more inconvenient. My own position is that I have begun to wonder whether we have made a mistake." "Have you?" "Don't do that." Mildly. "The sarcasm is beneath you, and it costs you nothing to be plain with me. I have 3 seats on the bench asking why a woman who is demonstrably locked up is still killing people. And I have a minister who would like the matter closed. And I have a very narrow window in which someone might reopen your case before it is buried under 6 months of procedure." He spread his hands. "I would like to use that window. I cannot use it empty-handed." "And what would fill it?" "A name." He said it gently. "Whoever had access to your work, whoever could reproduce your hand well enough to satisfy 3 examiners, whoever you spoke to about the tribunal audit." There it was. She felt it go through her like a wire drawn tight. It was so smooth, so beautifully placed, that if she had not spent 3 nights lying on a freezing floor with a splinter of slate in her fist, she would never have caught it, because he had said the tribunal audit as though it were common knowledge, as though it had been in the trial, and it had not been in the trial, Not once. Not in 11 days. The prosecution had never mentioned the audit at all, and she had assumed at the time that this was because it was irrelevant. And she understood now, sitting in a warm room with a cup in her hands, that it was because it was the only thing that mattered, and he had wanted it nowhere near the record. "He will ask you who you told," the last fragment of slate had said. "Say nobody. Not because it protects you, because it protects them." "I didn't speak to anyone about it," she said. "Come now." It was a records review. It was 140 hours of cross-referencing transcripts against sentencing sheets, and it bored everyone I mentioned it to within a sentence and a half. She lifted the cup and drank, and her hands were steady, and she was distantly proud of that. "I don't have confederates, Mr. Selwyn. I have colleagues who have stopped writing to me, and a best friend who wasn't allowed in the room." Something moved behind his eyes, very small, a calculation adjusting itself. "You requested a sealed docket," he said. "I request a lot of things. You wrote to me twice." "I wrote to you twice," she agreed, "and you never answered, and now you're sitting in a prison offering me biscuits, so I suppose the second letter arrived." The silence went on a beat too long. Outside the glass, a gull went past and cried once, and the sound was so violently alive that it made her want to put her hands over her ears. "You are not helping yourself," Selwyn said at last, and there was no anger in it, which was worse. "I'm not trying to help myself. I'm trying to work out why you came in person." She set the cup down. "You have 12 people who could have taken this interview. You have a head of department and a chief aura and a stenographer. And instead, the deputy of the chief warlock got on a boat in September and crossed 40 miles of open water to sit in a room with a convicted murderer and ask her personally who she talked to." She met his eyes. "That isn't procedure. That's an errand." For a moment, barely a moment, his face was completely empty. Then he smiled and folded his napkin and stood. "You have been in this place for less than a fortnight," he said, drawing on his gloves finger by finger. "You are still speaking in paragraphs. I have seen what 6 months does to that. I have seen what a year does." He looked down at her, and his voice remained perfectly pleasant. "I will come back in the spring, Miss Granger, and you will tell me the name, and you will be grateful for the tea." He was at the door when she said it. "Who is 7? She had not planned to. It came up out of her like something surfacing. Selwyn stopped. He did not turn around. His hand stayed on the doorframe, and she watched the leather over his knuckles go taut, and then, slowly, ease. "There is no 7, he said. "5th level, west corridor, the cell beside mine." "The cell beside yours is empty." He turned then, and his face had rearranged itself into something patient and sorrowful. "This is what I mean about 6 months. It comes on faster in the clever ones. You should be careful what you talk to in the dark, Miss Granger. It talks back." The door closed. She got 2 more days of light in that window burned onto the inside of her eyelids, and then the guards took her down, and the stairs went black again, and she counted them, and there were 94. She waited until the cold came and went. She waited until the corridor had thawed by that 1 degree. Then she went down onto the floor and put her mouth close to the gap and said, "Everything you wrote was right. cloth moved on stone. He had been lying near the wall. She wondered, with a jolt she did not examine, how long he had been lying there waiting to hear whether she had come back. "Which part?" said the hollow voice. "All of it. The fire, the tone, the name." She pressed her forehead against the cold flags. "He told me not to talk to you. He said the cell beside mine is empty." The pause stretched. "It is," said Seven. "Don't. On the register, it is. There is no entry for this cell. There has not been an entry for 1100 days. A dry sound. "I am an accounting error with a food ration." "That's not possible. Prisoners are logged. There's a warrant. There is a clause," he said, "called the silent judgment." She stopped breathing. The sea went on far below, that slow, dull thud, and somewhere down on the third level, a man was weeping in the rhythmic, unhurried way of someone who has been at it for years. And Hermione Granger lay on the floor of a cell in Azkaban with her heart slamming against the stone. "Say that again. You heard it. Say it again." "The silent judgment," he said, "is a provision of the 1740s, never repealed, that permits the Wizengamot to remove a man from the record entirely where his testimony would, in the judgment of the court, cause greater harm than his crime. No trial, no name, no face, no speech. Each phrase came out flat, worn smooth, a thing recited so often it had lost its edges. He is given a number, he is given iron, and he is kept until he stops being inconvenient, which is generally when he stops being alive." "I asked for that docket," she whispered. "I know. I asked for it twice. I wrote to Selwyn about it twice. And 19 days after the second letter, the first Auror died." She was shaking now, and it had nothing to do with the cold. "It's you. The sealed file is you. That's why I'm here. He didn't frame me because of the hex or the clearances. Those were the tools. He framed me because I was 3 inches from finding out that there's a man in Azkaban who was never tried, and he needed me somewhere I couldn't file another request." Her voice cracked. "He put me in the cell next to yours. He put me here. Why would he put me next to you?" "Because he is arrogant," said Seven, "and because he wanted you to spend your life a yard away from the answer and never be able to prove it." "Then tell me. Tell me what you know, and I'll find a way. There are ways. There's a chaplain who comes at Candlemas. There are letters. There are—" "Granger. Tell me your name." "I can't," he said, and it broke out of him, and it was the first time she had heard anything in that voice that was not iron, and the sound of it went into her like a hand closing around her ribs. Then, quieter, ragged. "Do you think I have not tried? Do you think I have lain here for 1100 nights and not tried?" She had both palms flat against the wall now, as though she could push it out of existence. "What does it do to you?" she said. "When you try?" He was silent for so long that she thought he had gone. "Put your hand through," he said. "What?" "Through the gap, slowly." She did not think about it. That was the thing she would remember afterward, lying awake in the years to come, that she did not think about it at all. She turned onto her side and slid her arm along the freezing flags and pushed her hand through the 2-finger slot into the dark of the other cell, into air like the inside of a well, and held it there. Cloth. Then, hesitantly, and she felt him hesitate, felt the whole enormous weight of 1100 days in that pause. The cloth was drawn back, and bare fingers touched hers. They were ice cold. They were long and thin, and there were ridges of old scarring across the knuckles, and they trembled once, violently, at the contact, like a man touching fire. "Now," he said, very low, and she could hear the iron in it, and, for the first time, the man underneath the iron. "Listen, and do not speak until I have finished, because I will not be able to start again." His fingers stayed against hers the whole time he spoke. She thought afterward that he had needed them there, that a man who has not touched another human being in 3 years cannot say difficult things into empty air, that he had to be holding on to something. "There were 406 trials," he said. "You have read the transcripts, so you know that they were not trials, not most of them. There was a fortnight in the June after the war when the Wizengamot heard 19 cases in a single day, and they did it because the country wanted to see the machine running, and nobody wanted to be the man who slowed it down." "I know," she said. "You said you would not speak." She shut her mouth. Selwyn ran the pre-trial office. Every docket passed his desk before it reached the bench. He decided what evidence went up and what stayed in the drawer, and the bench never saw the drawer because there was no procedure that required them to. A pause. She felt his hand shift very slightly, the ridged knuckles turning against her palm. In the drawer were the letters. Outside, the sea. Inside, her own blood in her ears. During the war, there was a man who sold names. Not many. 9 over 2 years. But they were good names. Safe houses, 2 members of the Order's outer ring, a Muggle-born registry clerk who had been forging exemptions. He sold them through an intermediary in writing because he was careful and he wanted a record in case he ever needed to prove that he had been coerced. That is the kind of care that ruins men. He kept his own letters. Another pause. Longer. After the war, those letters were in a box in a house in Wiltshire because the intermediary had been my father. She did not move. She did not breathe. She had known. Some part of her had known since the 3rd night, since the way he said her name. But hearing the shape of it arrive was another matter entirely, and she found she had closed her hand around his fingers hard enough to hurt. He did not pull away. "I found them when I was 17, he went on, and his voice had gone very level, the levelness of a man walking a narrow thing. "I did not understand what they were. I understood in the spring, when the trials started, and the man whose handwriting was on all 9 of them stood up in the chamber wearing a gold pin shaped like scales and told 406 people what justice required. "You went to someone," she said. "You are speaking. You went to someone." "I went to Kingsley Shacklebolt," he said. "I was 19 years old, and I had a box of letters and a name that everyone in Britain had decided was clean, and I walked into the ministry through the front door because I actually believed, that if the evidence was good enough, it would not matter who was carrying it." The dry, ruined sound. "I got as far as the 2nd floor. Her eyes were burning. "They arrested you." "They arrested me for possession of documents relating to the war, which is not a crime, and held me under the emergency provisions, which had not lapsed." Selwyn came down at 2 in the morning. He was alone. Something changed in the voice then, thinned, took on an edge she had not heard. He read them in front of me, all 9. He took his time, and when he had finished, he told me that I had a choice, and that the choice was this. He could destroy the letters, and I could go to Azkaban with my name on the roll, and every reporter in the country would write that Lucius Malfoy's son had been caught trying to blackmail the architect of the trials. Or he could invoke the silent judgment, and I could go quietly, and my mother would be told I had fled the country and would go on believing it. You chose this. I chose the one, he said, where she does not have to read about me in the Prophet every year on the anniversary. The cold in the corridor had begun again, the fine crackling in the ears, but neither of them moved. He needed you silent, Hermione said. Her voice came out strange. Not just imprisoned, silent. That's what the mask is. The mask is a name curse, said 7. The iron is only the vessel. It was fitted at a throat and the jaw, and it takes speech at the point where speech becomes identity. I can say water. I can say Dementor. I can say your name. Another of those trembling shifts of his fingers. I cannot say mine. If I reach for it, the thing tightens, and the last time I reached for it in earnest, I lost 4 days and woke on this floor with my mouth full of blood. Then don't reach for it. She was gripping so hard now. Do you hear me? Don't ever reach for it again. Granger, I mean it. It can be broken, he said. She stopped. What? Every binding of that class has a release. There is no such thing as a permanent silence, only an expensive one. He spoke faster now and lower because the cold was coming, and they both knew what the cold did to conversation. The silent judgment is old law, and old law is sentimental. The condition is written into the enrollment. The name may be restored by the voice of one who knows the man, freely spoken and meant, not read, not guessed, known. Then I'll. You cannot, he said. That is the joke, and it is a good one. You would have to know me, and the curse eats every route by which you could learn. I cannot tell you. I cannot write it. I have tried, my hand stops. If you saw my face, you would not have a name to attach to it, because the enrollment takes the face out of the memory of anyone who has not held it for years. My mother would look at me in the street and see a stranger. The cold was on them now, sinking through the flags. So, you would have to arrive at it entirely from the outside, from evidence, from 140 hours of cross-referencing. She let out a sound that was not quite a laugh. You've thought about this. I have thought about very little else, he said, since a woman was put in the cell beside mine who spends her nights reciting the Gamp exceptions to a wall. You listened to that? You got the 4th one wrong. I did not. Twice, he said, and there was something in the ruined voice that she would have called, in any other man, in any other place, warmth. And she pressed her forehead to the stone and laughed, silently, shaking, with the temperature dropping, and her hand locked around the fingers of a man she had never seen. Then the corridor went black, in the way that has nothing to do with light, and neither of them let go. It came differently that night. She learned that they had preferences. They liked her mother. They liked the manor floor. They liked the 11 days. And they came back to the same wounds the way a tongue goes back to a broken tooth. But this time, before it took her under, she felt his grip change. His whole hand closed over hers, not gently, hard, palm to palm, and through the gap in the wall came his voice, flattened, tin-edged, absolutely steady. "Count the drops." "I can't hear them." "Then count mine." A ragged breath. "1." She could not answer. "2, Granger." "3," she said. "4." They got to 211. Somewhere around 140, her mother's face stopped coming, and there was only the count, only the cold flags and the pressure of his fingers, and the alternation of two voices in the dark, his and hers, his and hers, like a pulse, like something being pumped between two rooms. At 180, her teeth had stopped chattering. At 200, she realized the corridor had warmed, and they were simply still counting, because neither of them wanted to be the one who stopped. At 211, he said, "It has gone." "I know." "You can let go." "I know," she said, and did not. He said nothing. She listened to him not saying it. And after a while, his thumb moved, once, across the back of her hand, from the knuckle to the wrist. A slow, deliberate stroke, the whole distance of it, the only caress available to a man behind a wall. And then his hand withdrew, and the cloth came down over his fingers, and the gap was only a gap again. She lay on her back on the floor with her arms still outstretched, and looked at nothing at all, and her hand went on burning where he had touched it, and she thought, with an appalled clarity that arrived from nowhere and would not go away. Oh no. Winter came. The window slot filled with a light that was grey at both ends of the day, and there were mornings when the sea threw spray so high that a fine salt rain came in through the opening and froze on the wall in a lace of white. Her ration thinned, the trough iced over. She began to feel the particular emptiness he had described, the hollowing, the sense that the visitations found less to eat each time and therefore did not stay as long, and that this was not strength. And she began to work. That was the thing that saved her, and she knew it, and she knew who had given it to her. He had put a problem in front of her, arrive at it from the outside, and a mind like hers, starved of everything else, went at it the way a fire goes at dry timber. They talked every night. The cold hour became the working hour. She would lie with her cheek on the flags and put a question through the gap, and he would answer or refuse to answer, and the refusals were data too. "When were you born?" "I can't. Not the date, the season." A pause. "Cold." "Winter." "Good." "Family." "One of each. Both alive when I came here. I have not been told otherwise, which means nothing, because I am not told anything." "School." "Yes." "House." Silence. "That's a house I can eliminate then, because you'd have said it if it were Hufflepuff." "Would I?" "Everyone says Hufflepuff," she said. "It's the only one nobody's ashamed of." And she heard him make that broken sound again, and she smiled at the dark and hated herself for how much she had come to want it. She built him out of fragments. Left-handed, she worked that out from the slate, from the way the letters leaned, and confirmed it when he pushed things through the gap, and it was always the same hand that came first. Tall, or he had been. She heard where his voice came from when he stood, the changed angle of it. Educated in a way that showed itself in odd places. He knew the Latin of the silent judgment by heart, and pronounced it like someone who had been made to learn Latin young and expensively. He knew Quidditch. He knew it the way players know it, not spectators. And once, when she said something careless about a Wronski feint, he corrected her with such immediate, unguarded contempt that they both went quiet afterward, because they had both heard it. A whole person surfacing for a second and going under again. He knew her too. That was the thing that kept snagging. He knew she took her tea with too much sugar. He knew she chewed the ends of her quills. He knew, one night in December, without her having said it, that she had been in the manor drawing room. And he knew it because she had gone silent at the word drawing room. And he had said immediately, in a voice like a man stepping back from a ledge, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry," and had not spoken again for an hour. "Everyone knows your name," he had said on the first night. Not like that they don't, she thought. She did not let herself follow it. She was aware of doing that, of the deliberate turning away, and she told herself it was discipline. It was not discipline. It was the simple animal knowledge that she had one thing left in the world, one voice in one wall, and that if she chased it too hard, she might find something that made it impossible to go on lying with her hand through the gap at 2 a.m, counting. In February, the chaplain came for Candlemas and did not stop at the 5th level. In March, the guards on the west corridor were changed, and the new pair walked at different hours, and for 11 days, Seven said almost nothing at all while he learned them. And in the last week of March, at a little before 3 a.m, he woke her by scratching on the wall. "Granger. Wake up, sit against the wall and listen, and do not make a sound." She was awake instantly. There was something in the voice she had never heard in it, a tautness, an urgency stripped of all its usual dry armour. "What's happened?" "Selwyn is on the water," he said. "The signal light went twice on the South Rock at midnight. He does not come in winter. He does not come at night. He's coming here to close something." A breath. "How fast can you learn a route?" She sat up so fast her head struck the shelf. "What route?" "The one I have been building," said Seven, "for 1106 days. He gave it to her in the dark, in pieces, the way he had given her everything. Below the 5th level, the west wall is not stone all the way through. There is a shaft. It was cut for a hoist when they built the upper tiers, and it was bricked at both ends when they finished, and the brick at the bottom is below the tide line, which means the mortar has been drinking salt water for 300 years. "How do you know that?" "Because I have been listening to it," he said. "When the tide turns, it makes a sound. Stone does not make that sound. Wet brick does." She had her palms flat on the flags. "You can't go through a wall without a wand." "You can go through mortar with a splinter of slate," said Seven, "if you have nothing else to do until you die." She thought about the piece of slate, the edge worn smooth on one side, the point filed on the other. 1100 nights of a man scraping at a seam in the dark with a shard of rock, and no certainty whatsoever, and she put her hand over her mouth and pressed hard. "How far have you got?" "Through. 8 weeks ago." 8 weeks? You've had a way out for 8 weeks, and you didn't— "It comes out on the sea stair," he said, cutting across her. "Under the water at high tide. Twice a month on the low springs, it clears for about 40 minutes, and one of those windows is Thursday. And I did not tell you before because I was still deciding whether I would take you with me or leave you here. and I would rather you understood that plainly than found it out later." The words landed and sat there. "Why?" she said. "Because you slow me down. Because two people crossing that stair is twice the noise and twice the cold and half the chance. Because I have a route and a night and one shot at it, and you have been in this building for 6 months and cannot walk down 94 steps without counting them out loud. And I have been unable," he said, with a kind of dead precision, "to make the arithmetic come out in a way I can live with." She sat with her back against the wall in the freezing dark and found that she was smiling, horribly, with her eyes streaming. "You're an appalling man." "Yes." "Thursday," she said. "What do I need to know?" He told her. He told her for 2 hours, and then the next night, and the next. And she memorized it the way she had once memorized entire textbooks in a summer. The count of steps to the shaft mouth, the 2 courses of brick that had to be lifted in order and put back in order, the fact that the tunnel turned twice, and that at the second turn it dropped, and she must go down feet first and blind, because there was no room to turn a body around. The patrol on the sea stair walked at the quarter hours. The gulls nested on the lower ledge and would go up in a sheet if they were disturbed, and that was the alarm nobody had ever needed to install. And the Dementors. "They do not see," he said. "They feel. They feel warmth, and they feel what is in you. The cold does half of it for us, but on that stair you will be afraid, and fear is a lamp." Then what do I do? Think of something so ordinary that it has no edges. A pause. Not your friends, not your family, not the day you were happy. Anything with love in it burns. Find something small and stupid that you have never once cared about. She lay there for a long moment. "A blue cup," she said, "chipped at the rim. Good. It isn't small and stupid. It's the last thing I touched in my own kitchen." "Then it will burn," he said flatly. "Find another." "I don't want another." She turned her face to the gap. "I've been going into that memory every time they come, for 6 months, because it's the only thing that's mine. And it's not a happy memory, and it's not sad. It's just a cup on a counter. That's the point. It's the moment before. And if I can hold on to the moment before, then whatever comes after is still—" Her voice cracked, and she let it. "Is still not finished yet." The silence on the other side of the wall was total. "Say something," she said. "I can't," said Seven, and this time she did not think it was the curse. Thursday came in with a gale. That was the peace neither of them had accounted for, and afterward she thought it was the only reason it worked. The wind came off the northeast and drove the sea against the rock in a way that shook the fortress at its foundations, a low, continuous shuddering that got into the teeth, and the guards on the upper tiers stayed in the guardroom with the fire built up, and the whole sound-drinking hush of the wards was drowned under 40,000 tons of moving water. She heard the brick go at 1:30. 2 courses lifted in order. A hole in the base of her own wall where there had been no hole, and cold air coming through it. And then, because he had cut it from both sides, because he had been widening a seam under her floor for 8 weeks without telling her, a hand, not through a gap, a whole hand, arm to the elbow, palm up, waiting. She put her hand in it and he pulled her through. She came out into the shaft on her stomach with grit in her mouth, and there was no light at all, and she felt him beside her, the actual physical fact of him, a shoulder against her shoulder, and heard the ruined breathing of a man who has just done something enormous. "Granger, here, do not touch my face." She had not been going to. She had not been thinking about it. But the way he said it, fast, low before anything else, before hello, before the tunnel, went through her like a splinter. "All right. If you take the iron off without the release, it takes the jaw with it. Flat, rehearsed. I am telling you now, because in the next hour there may be a moment where you think you are helping." "All right," she said again. "Move." They went down. It took an hour and 11 minutes, and she lost all sense of it after the first turn. The tunnel was the width of a body, and the walls were slick, and there were places where she had to exhale to fit through, where the rock closed on her ribs, and the panic came up under her breastbone like a hand. And each time it did, from ahead of her in the black, came a voice with tin in it saying her name, once and nothing else, and each time she got moving again. At the second turn, she went down feet first, blind, exactly as he had said, and her boots found nothing for the length of a breath, and then found stone. And then, ahead, grey, actual grey, a ragged mouth of it, and beyond it, the roar. The sea stair was a flight of 40 steps cut into the outer rock, running down from a service door to a landing that was under water for 22 hours out of the 24. It was black with weed, and it was shining, and the wind coming up, it was full of flung salt. "Wait," he said, "the quarter hour." They crouched in the mouth of the tunnel, and it was there, in that first true light she had seen in 6 months, that she looked at him. A tall man, or he had been, too thin now, the grey prison robe hanging off the shoulders like sailcloth, hands scarred across the knuckles, hair long and matted and colourless with filth hanging over the metal, and the mask. It was not the theatrical thing she had built in her mind. It was cruder and worse. A hood of dull iron shaped roughly to a head, riveted at the crown and along the jaw, with a slot at the mouth barely wide enough to admit a spoon and 2 rough apertures for the eyes. There were no hinges. There was no seam that opened. Around the throat it narrowed to a collar, and the collar was welded, and where the metal met the skin at the base of the neck, the flesh had grown up against it in a ridge of hard white scar tissue. 3 years of a body trying and failing to reject something. She saw all of it in about 2 seconds. Then he turned his head, and she saw the eyes through the apertures. They were grey. They were very light, almost silver in that half-dark, and they were looking at her with an expression she had no chance of reading, and something old and unwelcome turned over in her chest, a recognition without an object, the sensation of a word on the tip of the tongue. "Don't," he said quietly. "I wasn't. You were." The quarter hour came. He went out onto the stair first. They got 12 steps down before the gulls went up. It was not their fault. A wave came across the lower landing and lifted the whole nesting ledge in a sheet of white and screaming, and the sound went up the rock like a flare. And above them, thin and clear through the gale, a horn began. "Run," he said. She ran. The weed took her feet out on the 19th step, and she went down hard on her hip and slid 4 steps, and his hand had her by the wrist before she stopped, hauling, and they were moving again, and the sea was coming up over the landing in slow, enormous heaves, and the boat was there, a rotten thing lashed under the ledge, a fishing skiff that had been wedged in that crevice for a decade, and that he had been checking, she realized, every low spring for 8 weeks. And then the cold came down the stair behind them. Not weather, the other cold. 3 of them pouring down the rock face from the service door, and the light went out of the world. She got 4 more steps. Then her legs stopped taking instruction, and she was on her knees on the wet stone with the sea in her face. And her mother was there, looking up with that pleasant, empty warmth. "Hello, can I help you?" And Harry's fists on his knees, and Selwyn folding his napkin, and the whole black weight of 6 months coming down on her at once. Something with no edges. The cup. She got it up in front of her mind like a shield. Blue, chipped at the rim, the small, cool weight of it. Setting it down on the counter. Setting it down. And it held. For a heartbeat it held. And then it went the way he had said it would go, because the kitchen was behind it, and her father's coat on the hook, and it burned. And she felt the thing above her lean in, and she opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Then an arm came around her from behind and hauled her up against a body that was all bone and shaking, and a hand closed over hers, palm to palm, hard. "Count," said the tin voice against her ear, and he was not steady now. He was ragged. He was going under too. "Granger, count. 1, she said. 2, 3. They went down the stair like that, step by counted step, half falling, gripping. 28, 29. The cold stayed above them. 34. He got her over the gunwale and into the skiff, and she landed in 6 inches of freezing bilge, and he came in after her and cut the lashing with a shard of slate, sawing, hands slipping. 41, 42. And the sea took them off the rock like a hand sweeping crumbs from a table. The last thing she saw of Azkaban was the tower going up into the dark, and 3 thin shapes standing at the head of the stair, not following, because the water was moving, and there was nothing left on the rock warm enough to be worth having. She lay in the bottom of the boat with her cheek in the bilge and laughed. And it came out wrong and turned into something else. He was at the stern. He had one hand on the tiller and one hand still wrapped around hers, and the iron of his face was running with spray, and he was breathing like a man who has been held under. "Where?" she got out. "Where do we go?" "West," he said. "There is a light on the Caithness coast that has been out of service since 1962. "How do you know that?" He turned his head, and the grey eyes came around to her, and the wind took his voice and thinned it almost to nothing. "Because I have had," said Seven, "a great deal of time." The lighthouse stood on a headland of black rock with the whole Atlantic laid out in front of it, and it had been empty for so long that the gulls had taken the lamp room, and the kitchen door had rotted off its hinges and lay in the grass like something dropped. They got there on the 4th morning. She remembered almost nothing of the crossing. Salt water and hunger, and the tin voice saying her name at intervals to check that she was still in the world. She remembered him bailing with the cup, the dented one, and understood only later that he had carried it out of Azkaban in the front of his robe. She remembered the moment the skiff struck shingle and he went over the side into water to his waist and dragged her out with an arm under her knees and her back. And she remembered the way his breathing sounded when he set her down on the stones, and that she had not known a man could be that tired and still standing. Then a fever took her, and the world went white and formless for 9 days. She surfaced in pieces. There was a room with a curved wall and a small window full of light. There was a mattress that smelled of dust. There was always the noise of the sea below the cliff, and always at the edge of her hearing, the small domestic sounds of somebody moving carefully so as not to wake her. She surfaced properly on the 10th day, and the first thing she saw was Iron. He was sitting on the floor with his back to the wall and his knees drawn up, asleep, or as close to it as a man in that thing ever came. And she lay looking at him in the grey sea light, with her heart going hard, and thought, "I don't know you at all." And then, immediately underneath it, with a kind of horror, "And I would have gone anywhere you told me." They lived like that for 11 weeks. He had chosen well. The lighthouse had been shut in the year the automatic lamp came in, and the Muggle authority that owned it had forgotten it in the way institutions forget things. And there was nobody within 4 miles but a farmer with 200 sheep who never came past the cattle grid. There was a spring above the house. There were mussels on the rocks at low water, and there was a walled garden gone feral with potatoes and kale that had been seeding themselves for 60 years. And there were rabbits, and he snared them, and she did not ask where a man who had been in prison for 3 years had learned to set a snare until much later, and the answer was that he had read about it and had never done it before, and had failed 11 times before he got one. They had no wands. That was the shape of everything. She had not understood before how much of her was magic, not the spells, the assumption, the reflex to reach for a thing across a room, the certainty that a cut could be closed and a fire could be lit and water could be made clean. Without it, she was a woman with hands, and the hands blistered and the blisters broke, and she learned to bandage them with strips of the lining of a coat he had found in the keeper's cupboard. There was one bed, and he never once went near it. He slept downstairs in the lamp room, sitting up, because he could not lie flat. That was one of the first things she worked out. The collar was welded, and the iron had weight, and a man cannot rest his head on anything, and so for 3 years he had slept the way she had seen him sleep on the floor of that room, upright, back to a wall, in 20-minute pieces. "How long?" she asked him in the 2nd week, when she could stand for more than an hour. "Since you slept a whole night." He was at the table scaling a fish with a piece of tin. 3 years, he said. "That isn't possible." "You are describing my life," said Seven, not making an argument. She sat down opposite him. There was a rhythm to the tin against the scales, and a smell of the sea. And outside the light was doing the thing it did on that coast in late spring, going gold at 9 in the evening and staying gold. "Lean forward," she said. The tin stopped. "No. I'm not going to touch the mask. I'm going to touch your shoulders, which have been holding a stone's weight of iron for 3 years, and which I can see from across a room are locked solid." She kept her voice level. You'll do more harm carrying it like that than the thing does on its own." He did not move. "Why?" he said. "Because you're in pain, and I can do something about it, and there is almost nothing else in this house that I can do anything about." He sat there for a long moment with the tin in his hand. Then he set it down, very precisely, and turned on the stool and faced away from her and said nothing at all. She stood behind him. Her own hands were shaking, and she was glad he could not see it. She put them on his shoulders. He went rigid. It was not flinching. It was the whole body going to stone, a total refusal. And she waited, not pressing, just resting there with her palms on the coarse cloth and the sharp architecture of bone underneath. And she counted, silently. And somewhere around 40, he let out a breath, and the stone gave a little. She worked at him for half an hour. Neither of them spoke. The muscle across the top of his back was in a state she had never encountered in a living person, ridged and knotted like rope, soaked and dried and soaked again. And when she found the worst of it, at the base of the neck where the collar sat, he made a sound. It was very small. It came out through the mouth slot, cut off almost before it started, and it was not pain. She stopped. Her hands stayed where they were. "Don't," he said. "Don't what?" "Don't stop." She did not stop. It changed something, and neither of them acknowledged it, and after that it happened most evenings. It became the shape of the day, the tide, the garden, the fish, the light going gold, and then the two of them in the kitchen with the door open to the sea, and her hands on his back for half an hour, while neither of them said anything at all. It was the least intimate thing imaginable, and it was the most. And she lay awake upstairs afterward with her fingers still remembering the ridge of scar tissue at his collar, and told herself that this was gratitude, that a person who has been kept alive by another person will feel things that are not what they appear to be. She did not believe herself. She was, unfortunately, very bad at lying to herself. It was one of the least convenient features of her mind. The tells started in June. They were small, and there were a great many of them, and she began, without deciding to keep a list. He caught a cup. That was the first. She knocked a chipped mug off the edge of the table with her elbow, and it was falling, and it was going to break. And he took it out of the air with his left hand at knee height, without appearing to look at it, and set it back on the table, and went on with what he was doing. She stood there with her heart going, and said, "That was," and stopped, because there was no way to finish it that did not sound like an accusation. He did not react, but she noticed that for the next 3 days he was clumsy, deliberately, obviously, dropping things and fumbling the door latch, and she understood with a cold slide in her stomach that he had noticed her noticing and was covering. He held his cutlery wrong. He ate alone. That was fixed. Food had to go through the slot, and it was slow and humiliating, and he did it in the lamp room with his back turned. But he laid the table when there was a table to lay, and he laid it in a very particular way, knife and fork, and the third setting place for a spoon at the top that nobody in an ordinary house had bothered with since about 1920. It was the table setting of a house with staff. He said Granger like a wound. That one she had known for months and had refused to look at. Everybody had called her Granger at school. Half the ministry still did. But he said it with a specific weight on the first syllable. a small pressure, the way you press on a bruise to check it is still there. And once, in July, half asleep at the table with his head against the wall, he said it as a complete sentence, in a tone of pure, exhausted exasperation, the way you speak to somebody you have been arguing with for 7 years. And there was the ring. He wore no jewelry. He had come out of Azkaban with a prison robe and a shard of slate and a tin cup. But on the third finger of his right hand, there was a band of pale skin, unweathered, that had never quite gone away. And it was wide, and it sat high. And she had seen a ring like that. She had seen it across a classroom. She had seen it on a hand pointing at her in a corridor. She had seen it, once, at the edge of her vision, when she was on a drawing room floor, and somebody was standing by the door with his back half turned, and would not look at what was happening. The thought arrived one evening in the middle of July, and she was so unprepared for it that she dropped a pan. It went across the flags with a clatter like the end of the world. He came in from the lamp room fast, the way he always came when there was a noise, and stopped in the doorway. What happened? Nothing. She was on her knees picking it up. Her hands were doing a thing she could not control. Nothing. It slipped, my grip's still. Granger, don't. She stood up. She could not look at him. She looked at the window instead, at the light going gold over the water, and she heard her own voice come out thin and high and unfamiliar. Don't say my name for a minute. Just a minute. He did not move from the doorway. You have worked something out, he said. No. You are a very poor liar. It is one of the few things about you that has not changed. And there it was, right there, in the open. That has not changed, from a man she had met 6 months ago through a hole in a wall. She turned around. He was standing in the low doorway of a lighthouse kitchen with the sun behind him, thin as a rail, in a dead keeper's shirt with the sleeves rolled. And the iron over his face was the colour of the sea in November, and the grey eyes in the apertures were absolutely still. You knew me, she said, before. Silence. On the first night you said everyone knows your name, and I let you have that because I wanted the water and I wanted the voice, and I was too frightened to push. Her breath was going wrong. But you know that I chew my quills. You knew about the drawing room before I said a word about it. You corrected my Wronsky feint. You set a table for a house with servants, and you catch things left-handed like a man who played a position, and there is a mark on your finger where a signet used to be. She took a step. Who were you? Don't. Who were you? Granger. I have spent 6 months building you out of scraps, she said, and her voice broke open. Because you told me to. You said arrive at it from the outside, and I have. I've been doing it every hour since March, and now I'm close. I can feel that I'm close, and you're standing there telling me to stop. Because of what happens when you get there, he said. It came out of him so violently that she stopped. Because of what happens when you get there, he repeated, quieter, and his hands had gone into fists at his sides, and she watched the scarred knuckles whiten one by one. Because for 6 months, I have had a thing that no man in my position has any business having, which is a woman who talks to me, who counts with me, who puts her hands on my back in the evening and does not ask me for anything. His breathing had gone ragged inside the iron. And the day you have the name that ends. Not because you are cruel, because you will finally be able to see who has been holding your hand through a wall, and you will not be able to unsee it. And I would rather have another month of this than the rest of my life, knowing exactly what your face did in the moment you found out. The sea went on below the cliff. You don't know what my face would do, she said. I do. You don't. I was there, he said, when it happened before. And he turned and went out through the rotten doorway into the gold light. And she stood in the kitchen with a pan in her hand, and the whole shape of it standing in front of her at last, enormous, obvious, unbearable. And she did not go after him, because she had not yet decided what her face was going to do. She went down to the village. It took the whole of a day, 4 miles of sheep track to the cattle grid, then the coast road, then a bus that took Muggle money she had earned by mending a fence for the farmer with 200 sheep, who thought she was a hiker and did not ask questions and gave her £11 and a pork pie. The village had a post office and a library that opened 3 afternoons a week and a rack of newspapers by the door. She read every English paper going back a fortnight, standing up with her hands flat on the counter. There was nothing about a prison break. That was the first thing, and it took her a moment to understand it, and then she did. They could not report it. To report an escape from Azkaban, they would have to say who had escaped, and one of the two had no name, and the other was a woman the prophet had already buried. So the ministry had eaten it. Somewhere in a building in London, a very small number of people were looking for her very quietly, and Cassian Selwyn was one of them, and that was worse than a manhunt, because a manhunt has rules. But the library had something better than newspapers. The library had a computer. She had not touched one in 6 years. It took her an hour and a half and a great deal of help from a woman named Sheena, who ran the desk and assumed she was tracing family. And, in a sense, she was. She looked up the Sydney dental practice. It was still listed. Wendell and Monica Wilkins, and there was a photograph on the front page of the website, and her mother had let her hair grow out again, and Hermione put her hand over her mouth and sat in a library in Caithness and made no sound at all for 4 minutes. Then she wiped her face and went back to work, because there was a second thing she needed, and the Muggle world could not give it to her. She needed a wizarding newspaper from 3 years ago. Sheena, who was a marvel, found her a way. The archive of a spiritualist journal in Inverness that took a certain kind of advertisement, and among the notices of seances and lost cats, there was, in the issue for the 12th of August 3 years earlier, a single paid announcement of the kind that pure-blood families place when something has gone wrong and they wish to control the language. She read it twice on the screen and then made Sheena print it and paid 20 pence and walked out into the street and read it a third time, standing against the wall of the post office with the paper shaking in her hands. Malfoy. The family of Narcissa. Malfoy of Wiltshire announces with regret that her son has departed Britain and will not be returning. No correspondence is invited. The family asks for privacy. No name in it. Not one. A mother had put a notice in a paper about her only child and had not been permitted to write his name. And Hermione stood in a Scottish high street in July with the gulls going over and understood exactly what that meant. and understood that Narcissa Malfoy had known she was being made to lie and had done it anyway because the alternative was iron. She got back to the lighthouse at 10:30 at night in the long blue northern dusk, and he was standing on the headland where the path came up. He had been standing there, she realized, for some time. There was a hard wind off the water, and it had his shirt flat against him, and the light was almost gone, and he was simply standing on the cliff edge looking down the track. And when she came up over the last rise, he did not move and did not speak. "You thought I wasn't coming back," she said. "I thought a number of things. Say one of them." "I thought," said Seven, "that if you did not come back, it would be the correct outcome, and I have spent 9 hours failing to be glad about it." She walked past him into the house. He followed. She lit the lamp, a real one, oil, wick trimmed, the small triumph of a woman who had relearned fire, and set the printed page on the table under it and turned it around to face him. He looked at it. She watched the grey eyes track along the line of it, and she watched the exact moment they stopped. And then she watched the way his hand came up, slowly, the scarred left hand, and hovered above the paper without touching it, above the 2 words Narcissa Malfoy, and stayed there, trembling, for as long as it takes to say a rosary. "She's alive," Hermione said. "That's what I went for. That's what I brought you." The hand closed. He put it against his chest, over the sternum, and pressed, hard, the way you press on something that is bleeding. "Sit down," she said. "Please." He did not sit down. He went to the window and put both hands on the sill and stood with his back to her, and the iron caught the lamplight along the line of the jaw, and in the glass she could see the reflection of the mask and the black sea behind it. "I know," she said. "You do not. Draco Malfoy." The name went into the room like a stone into water. Nothing happened. She had half expected something, a crack, a sound, iron falling. And there was nothing, only the wind and the lamp guttering, and a man standing at a window with his shoulders locked. "You see," he said, "nothing. Then it is you. It changes nothing that it is me." He turned around and his voice had gone flat and fast, the way it went when he was frightened, and she knew that now she had 6 months of data, and she knew that. The release is not a password. Anyone can read a name off a piece of paper. It requires the voice of one who knows the man, and you do not know me, Granger. You know a hole in a wall. You know a set of habits you catalogued like a specimen. You have arrived at a name by deduction, and deduction is not knowledge. Don't tell me what I know. And I would rather you had never found it, because now you will look at me and see the manner, and there is not a single hour of this that survives you doing that. Stop telling me what I'm going to do. She had shouted it. It rang off the curved stone walls of a lighthouse kitchen, and both of them stood there in the aftermath, breathing. "You want to know what I did in the library," she said, low. "After I found that notice, I sat there for 20 minutes, and I made myself do the thing you're so certain of. I made myself go back to that room. Your aunt on the carpet, and the knife, and the sound, all of it, and you by the door. And you know what I found, Malfoy? You were 19. You were 19 years old, and you were the only person in that house who couldn't look, and I had that memory for years, and I never once let myself notice that, because it was easier to hate all of you at the same time. He had gone very still. "That is not forgiveness," he said. "That is arithmetic. It's the beginning of it." She came around the table. "And then I thought about the other 3 years. I thought about a man who lay on a stone floor in the cold and counted to 211 so that I would still be a person in the morning, who spent 1100 nights scraping mortar with a rock and could have gone in February and stayed until March because the tide was better for 2. Her voice was not steady. Who was so frightened of what my face would do that he was going to leave me in that place rather than find out, and then didn't. Who has never once asked me for anything. Granger. I know you, she said. Not the name. The name took me a library card and an afternoon. I've known you since the 2nd week, and the only thing I didn't have was what to call it. He made a sound then, inside the iron, and it was terrible, and he turned his face away. Look at me. No. Draco, look at me. He looked at her, and she crossed the space between them and took his face in both hands. He seized her wrists, instantly, hard enough to bruise, a reflex 3 years deep, and she did not fight him, did not pull, just stood with her palms flat against the cold riveted iron and her fingers along the jaw of it, and her wrists locked in his grip, and said, "I'm not taking it off. I told you I wouldn't. I'm not." His breathing had gone to pieces. She could feel it, coming through the slot, warm, uneven, against the inside of her wrist. "Then what?" he said. "This." And she leaned in and kissed the mask. She kissed the iron where the mouth should have been, and it was cold, shockingly cold, and it tasted of salt and rust and old metal, and it did not give, and it did not answer, and it was the most terrible kiss of her life. She kept her mouth there. She felt his grip on her wrists change, felt the fingers go slack, and then close again, not restraining now, holding, felt him make a sound she had no name for, a broken half-word that the iron ate before it reached the room. She drew back an inch, not more. "I'm not going to pretend that was a kiss," she said unevenly. "It was a promise. Do you understand the difference? Granger, say you understand it." "I understand it," said Draco Malfoy, in a voice with nothing left in it at all, and let go of her wrists and put his forehead against her shoulder, the iron against her collarbone, the whole cruel weight of it, the first time he had ever leaned on anything, and stood there while she got her arms around him and held on. They stayed like that for a long time. "It won't come off," he said eventually into her shoulder. "Then we do it the other way." She had her hand at the back of his neck, on the ridge of scar above the collar. "We don't need the curse to break. We need the sentence to break. If the enrollment is void, the binding's void with it, because the binding is a condition of the sentence and nothing else." Her mind was moving now, fast, the old machine turning over. The silent judgment requires the signature of the chief warlock's deputy. If the deputy is convicted of an offence that touches the case, every instrument he signed under that authority is voidable on review. Every single one. He raised his head. "You cannot prove any of it. The letters are ash." "Are they?" "He burned them in front of me." "He burned something in front of you," she said, "in a ministry holding room at 2 in the morning in front of a 19-year-old boy who had just been arrested. And a man that careful does not destroy the only leverage he has over a family with money. She was gripping his arms. Where were they kept before you took them? Not the box, the place. He was silent. Malfoy. The vault, he said slowly. Gringotts, 711. They were in the second chest with the estate papers, and my father's. Granger. The vault has been sealed by the ministry since the trials. Sealed, she said, not emptied. And I know something about getting into that bank that almost nobody alive knows. And there is exactly one person in Britain who was in the cart with me when I did it. And he has spent 6 months believing I killed 6 of his colleagues. And that was the moment the wards she had never had a chance to lay went entirely unneeded, because they both heard it. Down on the coast road, 4 miles off, carried up the cliff on a still night, the crack of apparition. Then another. Then a third, closer, at the cattle grid. Draco was already moving, dousing the lamp with the flat of his hand. In the sudden dark, he found her wrist. "How long?" she whispered. 10 minutes, he said. Perhaps 8. They went out through the seaward window and down the cliff path in the dark, and neither of them said a word for the first quarter of an hour, because talking uses breath, and the path was a goat track over wet rock with 140 feet of drop under it. Halfway down, she understood that he had walked it before, many times, in the dark, deliberately, learning it the same way he had learned a wall. At the bottom there was a shingle cove and the skiff, and above them the light of wandfire was going through the empty rooms of the lighthouse, room by room, unhurried. "He'll know we were there," she breathed, the lamps still warm. "He knows we were there. He has known for a week." Draco was pushing the boat down the stones. "Get in." "A week." "The farmer with the sheep," he said. "You mended his fence. Somebody paid him £11 to describe you, and he described you honestly, because he had no reason not to." The skiff took the water. "Get in, Granger, and take the tiller, and do not look back at the light." They went south along the coast on the ebb, hugging the black rocks, and by dawn they were in the mouth of a river 40 miles down, with the boat sunk in 6 feet of brown water and a stolen tarpaulin over the 2 of them in a hedge. It took them 9 days to reach London. She would remember it afterward as the strangest and in some ways the happiest 9 days of her life, which was an obscene thing to feel, and she felt it anyway. They walked. They travelled on the backs of lorries and in the guard's van of a goods train out of Perth. They stole from gardens and paid for nothing. He wore a coat from the keeper's cupboard with the collar up and a length of sacking wound over the iron like a bandage. And in the world's eye, he was a man with a burned face, and people looked away from him in exactly the manner she had feared and he had expected, and it turned out to be the most effective concealment available. And they talked, not through a wall. Side by side in ditches and under bridges, and once for 6 hours in the roof space of a disused chapel outside Carlisle, with the rain coming down and the whole afternoon in front of them, and nothing to do but speak. She learned what he had been like at 14, and hated it, and told him so. And he agreed with her, flatly, without performance, which disarmed her far more than an argument would have. She learned that his mother had taught him to set a table, and that his father had taught him to lie, and that he could not always tell, even now, which of them he was obeying. She learned that in his first year in the iron, He had tried to starve and had stopped and would not say why. He learned that she had not slept properly since the war, mask or no mask. He learned about the blue cup. He learned, she told him on the 5th night into the dark, because it was easier than looking at him, that she had begun listening for the sound of him turning over in the next cell before she had ever seen a hand. They did not touch in those 9 days. That was its own kind of weather. Twice their shoulders met by accident under a tarpaulin, and both of them went completely still, and the third time neither of them moved away, and they sat like that until the rain stopped. They came into London on a Tuesday on foot over the canal at Camden. Harry Potter's house had a door that had been Fidelius charmed by a dead man, and the charm had lapsed with him, and so it was only a door, and she knocked on it at 4 in the morning. He opened it in a dressing gown with his wand out and his hair on end, and he looked at the woman on his step for 2 full seconds without recognizing her. She was 2 stone lighter, and her hair was cut off at the jaw with a fish knife. And then he did. She had prepared a great many sentences on the way down. "Harry," she said, and none of them survived. He got her inside. He got both of them inside, and he did it with his wand still up and pointed at the man in the sacking, and Draco stood in the hallway with his hands very visibly open at his sides and did not say a word. "Who is that?" Harry said. "He's the reason I'm alive." "Hermione." 6 months, Harry. 6 months of Dementors on the 5th level, and he pushed water under a wall to me on the 1st night. Her voice went, "Point that somewhere else." Harry lowered it 2 inches, not more. "They told me you were dead," he said. "In April, Selwyn came to the house and told me that there'd been an incident on the sea stair, and they'd recovered nothing, and his jaw was working. "I sat shiver for you, Hermione. Ginny made me eat. There's a stone with your name on it in Godric's Hollow, because Molly wanted somewhere to go." She sat down on his stairs and put her head in her hands. It took the rest of that night to tell it, and most of the next day to be believed, and the thing that turned it was not her testimony. It was a piece of dented tin. She put the cup on Harry's kitchen table at about 11 in the morning and told him where it had come from and what it had been for, and Harry Potter looked at that cup for a long moment and then looked at the masked man standing by the window who had refused to sit down, and something in his face changed by a degree. "Right," he said. "Gringotts." It should not have worked. It worked because of 3 things, and she had counted on all of them. The first was that goblins do not care about ministry seals. A ministry seal on Vault 711 meant that the ministry had asked, and the request had been noted, and the contents were untouched, because the contents were the property of a family, and the bank's contract was with the family, and not with a government that had come and gone 11 times since the vault was cut. The second was that Narcissa Malfoy was alive, and was the surviving keyholder, and could be reached. The third was that Harry Potter could get a letter to her in an afternoon. She came at dusk to a room above a shop in Diagon Alley. A thin, upright woman in grey, older than 3 years, should have made her, with her hands folded in front of her and her chin high, in the way of somebody who has learned to walk through a world that whispers. Hermione had written the letter carefully. It said only, "I have information regarding your son. It is not what you have been told. Come alone." Narcissa read the room in one sweep. Potter by the door. The Granger girl at the table, ruined-looking, thin. And a tall man standing in the corner with sacking wound round his head, who had turned to face the wall the moment the door opened. "Well," she said, "I am here. Mrs. Malfoy, you will understand," Narcissa said, "that I have received a number of letters of this kind. Some of them wanted money. One of them wanted my house." Her voice did not tremble at all, and that was how Hermione knew what it was costing. "So, you will forgive me if I ask you to be very quick and very specific, Miss Granger, before I decide whether to be angry. He didn't leave the country. I know that." The room stopped. Narcissa's chin came up another fraction. "I know that," she repeated. "I have known it for 3 years. A woman does not write a notice like that of her own accord." Her hands, folded, had gone white at the knuckles. "I was given a choice between a public son in Azkaban and a private son abroad, and I was told there would be letters, and there was one letter in his hand, and there has never been another. So, you may say what you have come to say." "He's in this room," said Hermione. There was a silence that seemed to have no bottom. Then, very slowly, the man in the corner turned around. She did not scream. She did not fall. She stood absolutely still and looked at the sacking and the shape of the iron under it, and her mouth opened and closed once, and she said, in a voice that had cracked straight down the middle, "Take that off his face." "It's welded, Mom. Take it off his face." "It's a name curse," Hermione said. "It comes off when the sentence is void, and the sentence is void when the man who signed it falls, and I need the second chest in your vault to do it." Narcissa Malfoy did not look away from her son. "Then we go tonight," she said. The chest was where he had said it was. The letters were not. She had been ready for that. She had been ready for it since Caithness, and she made herself take the whole chest apart on the floor of a vault 90 fathoms under London, with a goblin holding a lamp. And it was in the false bottom of the estate box. Not the letters, better than the letters. A slim ledger in Lucius Malfoy's hand, recording every payment received from C. Selwyn between March of one year and June of another, with dates, with amounts, with the 9 names in the margin, and, folded into the spine, a single original in Selwyn's own writing, which he had missed because he had never known it existed. A note of 2 lines, instructing the intermediary to confirm that the registry clerk in Hackney worked Thursdays. She read it in the cart on the way up with her hands shaking so badly that Harry had to hold the lamp. "It's not enough for murder," she said. "It's enough for treason." "It's enough," Harry said grimly, "for a hearing." They filed it at 9 the next morning through the office of the chief warlock, over the head of the deputy, in the presence of 2 members of the bench and a reporter from the Prophet, whom Harry had woken personally at 6. And by 10 o'clock, the news had gone through the building like a fire in a flue. By 10:30, Cassian Selwyn had been suspended. By 11, he was gone from his office, and his flue was closed, and a search of his residence in Chelsea turned up nothing but a cold hearth and a wardrobe that had been emptied in a hurry. At 11:40, the Wizengamot convened an emergency session to consider the immediate custody of the fugitive Hermione Granger and the unregistered prisoner in her company. And Hermione walked into that chamber of her own free will and stood in the well of it, unshackled, with Draco Malfoy at her shoulder in an iron mask. She spoke for 50 minutes. She did not weep, and she did not plead. She laid it out the way she had once laid out the standards of evidence for magical signature analysis, clause by clause. And when she came to the silent judgment, she read the enrollment aloud from the statute in the original Latin and then in English. And she got to the release condition: the name may be restored by the voice of one who knows the man, freely spoken and meant. And she stopped. "With the Chief Warlock's leave," she said, "I would like to demonstrate that the enrollment is defective, because the man it was written for is known." Somebody in the upper tier said, "This is theatre." "It is evidence," said Hermione Granger. She turned around. He was standing 3 feet behind her in the middle of the floor of the highest court in magical Britain, with 400 people looking at him, and she could see his hands shaking at his sides. She walked up to him. She put both palms flat against the iron, exactly as she had done in a lighthouse kitchen, and this time he did not seize her wrists. "Look at me," she said, not quietly, because there was no point in quiet anymore. He looked at her. "I know who you are," she said. "I knew before I had the name, and I know now, and I am saying it because it is true, and not because a court requires it." Her voice did not break, which she considered afterward to be the single greatest act of magic she ever performed. Draco Lucius Malfoy. For a moment there was nothing. Then a sound came out of the iron like a nail being drawn from green wood, and the whole mask went white hot under her hands, and she did not let go. The heat went through her palms and up her forearms, and she held on. Somebody was shouting from the tiers. Somebody else was on their feet. She heard Harry's voice say very clearly, "Nobody move." And she heard the particular silence of 400 people deciding to obey Harry Potter. And then she heard nothing at all except the sound the metal was making. It did not shatter. It was not that kind of magic. It softened. Under her hands, the iron went from cold rivets and welded seam to something that gave, and then to something that ran. And it came apart along lines that had never been there, the whole cruel architecture of it unmaking itself backward through 3 years, and it went down the front of him and off his shoulders and struck the floor of the chamber in pieces that were already cooling, already only metal, already nothing. And a man stood in the middle of the well with his face uncovered. She had built him 100 times in the dark, and she had got almost all of it wrong. He was grey as candle wax. The hair had grown out past his shoulders, dull and colourless, and there was a beard of 3 years that had grown up around and under the collar and been sawn at with tin. The bones of his face stood out in a way that made her breath catch. Around his throat, from ear to ear, there was a band of hard white scar where the iron had lain, and it would never fade, and it never did. But his mouth was his own. He had a mouth. She had never once considered what it would be like to see it, and now she was looking at it, and it was open, and he was breathing through it, and his eyes had gone enormous. He said something. It made no sound. His lips shaped it, and nothing came, and a look of pure animal terror went across his face, and Hermione took hold of the front of his shirt with both hands. "Again," she said. He tried again. "Draco." It came out of him, cracked, tearing, in a voice she had never heard in her life, because she had only ever heard it strained through a slot in a mask. And it was lower than she expected, and rougher, and it broke in the middle. "My name is Draco." He said it to her, not to the court. He was looking straight at her, and he said it again, and again. And by the fourth time he was not saying it so much as pushing it out of himself, and his hands had come up and closed around her forearms, and then he stopped being able to stand. She went down onto the flagstones with him. She got her arms around his head and held it against her shoulder, and he shook, and there was no dignity in it at all, and 400 witches and wizards sat in absolute silence in the Wizengamot chamber and watched a man cry for the first time in 3 years, while the woman they had convicted of 6 murders held on to him and told him over and over that he could stop now, that he could stop. The rest of it took 11 weeks and was, compared to that morning, extraordinarily dull. The silent judgment was struck out by a vote of the full bench on the ground that an enrolment which had failed its own release condition in open court could not be said to have been lawfully constituted, and the statute of 1742 was repealed entire the following spring, and Hermione Granger's evidence on that point was cited in the debate. Selwyn was found in the second week of September in a rented cottage on Islay. He did not resist. He had been a careful man all his life, and he was careful about that too, and when they brought him in, he had a prepared statement in his pocket, and he read it out, and it was very good, and it did not survive the ledger. The murders were his. Not by his hand. That was Corbin Yaxley's cousin, a nondescript man named Ellery Rook, who had spent the war in a records office and had never been so much as questioned, and who had learned Hermione's own binding hex out of a paper she had published in the Journal of Applied Arithmancy, which she thought was the single most humiliating detail of the entire affair. But Selwyn had commissioned it. 6 Aurors had died, because 6 Aurors had sat on the panels that had processed the pre-trial dockets, and any one of them might one day have wondered why a certain file had never come up. He was given life. He asked, at sentencing, to be permitted to make a statement about the necessity of the trials, and the chief warlock refused him, and Hermione, sitting in the second row, found that she felt nothing at all about it, which surprised her and which she took as a sign that she was getting better. Her conviction was quashed on the 9th of October. There was compensation, which she accepted, and an apology from the ministry read aloud in the atrium, which she attended and did not enjoy, and an offer of reinstatement at a grade 2 levels above the one she had left, which she asked for time to consider. Draco was returned his name, his vault, his freedom, and the estate of a father who had died in the 2nd year of his son's imprisonment without knowing where his son was. He did not go back to the manor. He sold it in November, entire, to a trust that turned it into a school, and gave the money away in 4 directions, and did not tell anybody he had done it. And Hermione found out from a paragraph in the Prophet 8 months later, and said nothing about it, because by then she understood the man well enough to know that being thanked would have made him unbearable for a week. They did not live together at first. He stayed with his mother in a narrow house in Marylebone with too many stairs, and Hermione took a flat in Clerkenwell with a window that faced east, and for 4 months they saw each other almost every day and touched each other almost never. He was not well. That was the plain fact of it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He could not eat in front of people. 3 years of a slot and a spoon had done something to him that no healer could unpick in a season, and for a long time he took his meals alone with the door shut, and she would sit outside it on the landing with her back against the wall and talk to him through the door about nothing at all, about the ministry, about Sheena in the library in Caithness, about the appalling wallpaper in her new flat. And he would answer with his mouth full, and they would both notice, and neither of them would remark on it, that they were talking through a wall again, and that it was the easiest thing in the world. He could not sleep lying down. That took the longest. For 11 weeks he slept sitting up in a chair by a window because his body did not believe there was nothing on his neck. And the first night he woke at 4 in the morning, flat on his back in an actual bed. He panicked so badly that he put his fist through a pane of glass. And he could not, for a long time, be looked at. That was the one she had not predicted. He had spent 3 years being unable to be seen, and had come out of it unable to bear it. And in the first weeks, he wore his hair long and his collar high, and in company, he stood where the light was behind him, and when she caught him at it, he would say something scathing about her powers of observation and leave the room. She waited. She had learned to wait through a wall for 6 months. She was, it turned out, very good at it. It broke on a Tuesday in February in her kitchen in Clerkenwell at 8 in the evening over a burnt pan of rice. He had come to dinner. He had been coming to dinner every Tuesday since December, and they both behaved as though this were a coincidence that kept happening. She had ruined the rice, comprehensively, and had sworn at it, and had turned around to find him leaning in the doorway with his arms folded, watching her with an expression she could not read. "What?" she said. "Nothing. You've been standing there for 5 minutes." "4," said Draco Malfoy. "I have been counting. It is a habit." She put the pan down. The light in that kitchen came from one bulb over the table, and he was standing directly under it, which he never did, and she realized that he had chosen that place on purpose and had been standing in it for 4 minutes, waiting to see whether she would notice. He had cut his hair. It was short, the way it had been at school, and it was not colourless anymore. It had come back pale gold at the temples where the sun on the Caithness cliff had got at it in the summer. He had shaved. The scar around his throat was uncovered. The collar of his shirt was open, deliberately, 2 buttons, and the white band of it was there in the electric light for anyone to see. She crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of him. "Say it," she said. "Whatever you came here to say, you've been building up to it since Christmas, and I'm not going to do it for you." "You are not going to do it for me," he repeated. "You, who told me, on a cliff, exactly what I was going to feel about my own face for 9 consecutive minutes. That was different. It was not remotely different." But his voice had gone quiet, and his hands had come out of his folded arms, and he did not seem to know where to put them. "Granger. Hermione. I am aware of your name." He shut his eyes briefly. Hermione, I have been trying for 2 months to construct a version of this, in which I say something that is worth the wait, and I cannot do it, because everything I compose sounds like a man justifying himself, and I have spent my entire life justifying myself, and I am extremely tired of it. Then don't. Then I will tell you the true thing instead, which is worse. He opened his eyes. I have been afraid every single day since October that you loved a voice, that what you had was 6 months of the dark and a wall and the only kind hand available, and that when you finally had a face in front of you in ordinary light, in a kitchen with the rice burning, you would look at it and find that there was nothing there you wanted. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her hands on either side of his face. Bare skin, warm, a jaw with a day's stubble on it, and a small nick where he had cut himself shaving. And she felt him go rigid, exactly as he had gone rigid the first time. 300 miles and a lifetime north of here. Do you know what I did? She said. The night they took the iron off you. After, in my room, at Harry's. No. I put my hands over my face, and I sat there and I tried to remember what you look like. Her thumb moved along his cheekbone. And I couldn't. The curse takes the face out of the memory of anyone who hasn't held it for years. That's what you told me. And it was still working that first night. I had watched you cry on the floor of the Wizengamot with my arms around your head, and 4 hours later I could not have described you. She was not quite steady. So, I have spent every day since then learning it, on purpose, like a text. And I know that you have a crooked incisor on the left, and that when you're lying, your mouth goes flat before you speak, and that you have never once in your life smiled with your teeth showing where anyone could see it, and I have decided that I am going to fix that, and it is going to take me about 40 years. He made a sound. Hermione. So no, she said, not a voice. And she kissed him. He did not move for the first second, and she understood why and did not mind. And then his hands came up into her hair and he kissed her back, and it was not gentle at all. It was 3 years and 6 months and 9 days of a man who had been fed through a slot, and it was every night on a freezing floor with 2 fingers through a gap in the wall. And she found herself backed against the edge of the table with her fists in his shirt and his mouth warm and open on hers, and there was no iron in it anywhere. When they came apart, he did not let go of her. He stood with his forehead against hers, breathing hard, and she felt his thumb move across her cheek from the bone to the jaw, the whole distance of it, slow and deliberate, the same caress he had given the back of her hand in the dark of the 5th level when it was the only one available. That, she said unevenly, was a kiss. I had gathered. The other one was a promise. I have thought about the other one, said Draco, every day for 7 months. And she laughed, and it turned into something else halfway, and he held on to her while it did. They were married in the spring, 2 years later, in a registry office in Camden with 9 people present, because he could not tolerate a crowd, and she had discovered that she no longer wanted one. Harry stood up with them. Narcissa wore grey and wept exactly once. At the moment, her son said his own name aloud, and nobody remarked on it. She took the ministry post in the end, but not the one they offered. She wrote the review that abolished the sealed docket, And then she wrote the review that opened every one of the 406 trial records to the light, and 11 people came out of Azkaban as a result of the second one. And she went to the gate for all 11, personally, every time, and stood on the landing in the cold and walked them onto the boat herself. They kept the lighthouse. He bought it in the second year, absurdly, for very little money, and they mended the door and put glass in the lamp room and went up in August for a month every year and sat in the gold 9 o'clock light with the sea below the cliff and did not always talk. And on the bad nights, there were bad nights. There were always going to be bad nights, and she came to think of them not as a failure, but as weather. She would wake to find the bed empty beside her and a shape sitting up against the headboard in the dark, absolutely still, one hand at his own throat. She never turned on the light. She had learned that early. She would simply reach over and find his other hand and lace her fingers into it, palm to palm, the way it had been through a hole in a wall in the coldest hour on the 5th level of a prison in the North Sea. And after a while, out of the dark, in a voice that was scratched and low and entirely his own, he would say, 1, 2, she would answer. They rarely got past 20.
Thank you for staying with this story. I want to tell you where it started for me. It started with the water, that small tin cup pushed under a wall on the very first night. He does not know her, she does not know him. He does not ask for anything, he just gives her water, and he asks for the cup back before dawn. I kept thinking about that scene while I wrote. I kept asking myself one question. What is the smallest thing one person can do to keep another person alive? Not a rescue, not a big speech, just water, just a voice saying count with me. I also thought a lot about names. In this story, a man loses his name. The world forgets his face, and he still helps her every night for months, knowing she may never learn who he is. He does it anyway. I think that is the truest test of a person. What do you do when nobody will ever know it was you? And I thought about Hermione too. She does not fall in love with a face. There is no face. She falls in love with someone she cannot see. Only later does she learn the name, and by then she already knows the man. So, what is the story about? I think it is this. We are not who people say we are. We are not our worst year. We are what we do in the dark, at 2 in the morning, when no one is watching and there is nothing to gain. Draco could not say his own name for 2 years. He got it back only because someone else knew him well enough to say it and mean it. That is what love is here, not rescue, recognition. Somebody looks at you and says, I know exactly who you are, and I am staying. Thank you for listening. Take care of each other.